It is with no small hesitation that I commit the following account to paper. For among all the strange and perilous adventures which I have had the honor to share with my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, none has so profoundly tested not only his intellect, but his very resolve. There are cases, as the reader may well imagine, which challenge the faculties of observation, others which strain the limits of deduction, but this particular affair touched upon something far more unsettling, the narrow boundary between reason and ruin. The events in question began upon a night of uncommon severity, even by the standards of a London winter. A dense fog had settled upon the streets, muffling sound and swallowing light, so that even the familiar outline of Baker Street seemed distorted and uncertain. The lamps burned dimly beyond the window, their glow reduced to pale halos while within our sitting room. The fire alone provided a measure of warmth against the encroaching gloom. Holmes had been in one of his quieter moods that evening. Stretched languidly upon the settee, his long fingers steepled and his eyes half closed, though I knew from experience that his mind was far from idle. For my own part, I had been engaged with my notes, attempting to bring order to the records of a recent case, when the sudden and violent ringing of the bell shattered the stillness. An urgent visitor, I remarked, glancing toward the clock. At this hour, it can scarcely be otherwise. Holmes did not open his eyes. Or an urgent message. Watson, he replied. The distinction is often significant. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps were heard upon the stairs, followed almost immediately by a firm knock at the door. A delivery. "Sir," she announced, entering with a degree of unease I had rarely observed in her, brought by a man who would not give his name. In her hands she carried a parcel. It was of modest size, perhaps no larger than a man's hat box, wrapped in plain brown paper and secured with a length of dark twine. There was nothing remarkable in its appearance, no mark of origin, no seal, no distinguishing feature, yet something in the manner of its arrival lent it an immediate and inexplicable gravity. Holmes' eyes opened at once. "Pray set it upon the table." "Mrs. Hudson," he said calmly. She did so with evident reluctance. "The man who brought it." "Sir," she added, "he would not wait." Nor would he speak. He only said, she hesitated slightly, that it was to be opened by Mr. Holmes himself. Holmes sat up slowly, his interest now fully engaged. "Did he, indeed?" "Yes, sir." And then he was gone. Holmes rose from the settee and approached the table with measured steps, his gaze fixed upon the parcel as though it were an object of rare and delicate significance. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," he said. "You have done precisely as you should." When she had withdrawn, he stood in silence for a moment, studying the package without touching it. I joined him at the table, my curiosity now thoroughly aroused. "Well, Holmes," I said, "do you make anything of it?" "Of the parcel itself," he replied. "Very little at present. Of its timing, however, considerably more." "What do you mean?" Holmes gestured faintly toward the window, beyond which the fog pressed thickly against the glass. "A night chosen for obscurity. A messenger who refuses identification. A delivery made directly to these rooms, with instructions that I alone should open it. These are not the actions of chance, Watson, they are the elements of intention." I could not suppress a slight unease. "You suspect something dangerous." Holmes' lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "My dear fellow, I assume it." He bent slightly, examining the wrapping with close attention, his keen eyes noting details that entirely escaped my own observation. The paper is common, yet recently handled. The twine cut, not torn. No sign of haste, no irregularity in its binding. Whoever prepared this did so with care and with purpose. And the purpose. Holmes straightened, his gaze returning to the parcel itself. "That," he said quietly, is what we are meant to discover. I noticed then that his expression, though composed, bore a subtle intensitane alertness that suggested the matter was already of greater significance than its modest appearance would imply. "Shall you open it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he reached out and, with the lightest possible touch, turned the parcel slightly, examining its underside. "Not yet," he said at last. "Why not?" Holmes looked at me, and there was something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, perhaps even of caution that I had seldom seen. "Because, Watson," he replied, "it has been delivered with the express intention that I should do so." I felt a chill at his meaning. "You think it a trap?" Holmes inclined his head. "I think it a challenge." He moved then to the mantelpiece, where he took up his magnifying lens before returning to the table. "In my experience," he continued, "the most dangerous traps are not those which conceal themselves, but those which invite participation. And this does precisely that." Indeed, he bent once more over the parcel, his examination now even more meticulous. "Observe the absence of any accompanying message," he said. "No warning, no explanation. Leave the instruction that it be opened." This suggests confidence on the part of the sender. Confidence in what? Holmes' voice lowered slightly. In the outcome. Silence fell between us, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. At length, Holmes set down the lens and stepped back. "We shall not open it," he said. "Not at all." "Not yet," he corrected. "First, we must determine why it has been sent." He turned toward me, his expression now one of quiet resolve. "For I cannot escape the conclusion, Watson, that this parcel is not merely an object, but the opening move in a game, and the stakes." I asked. Holmes' gaze returned to the silent package upon the table. "The stakes," he said softly, "are likely to be far higher than the sender has chosen to reveal." At that moment, a faint sound reached us from the street below, so slight that I might have dismissed it had Holmes not turned instantly toward the window. "What is it?" I asked. He did not reply immediately. Instead, he moved to the glass and looked out into the fog-shrouded darkness. "For a game such as this," he said at last, "it would be most unusual if the first move were not observed." I joined him, peering into the gloom. Yet I could discern nothing. "Do you see someone?" Holmes remained still for a moment longer, then stepped back, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. But the pause before his answer was just long enough to convince me that, whether he had seen something or not, he believed quite firmly that we were no longer alone in the matter. And as I turned once more toward the unopened parcel upon our table, I could not shake the uneasy conviction that, in accepting its presence, we had already taken the first step into a mystery far darker than any we had yet encountered. Holmes did not at once return to his examination of the parcel after his brief inspection at the window. Instead, he resumed his place by the fire, though his posture had lost all trace of earlier ease. There was now a quiet tension about him, a coiled attentiveness which I could learn to associate with cases of unusual complexity. His eyes, though no longer fixed upon the parcel itself, seemed to hold it constantly within their peripheral awareness, as though he were measuring its presence against some internal calculation. "You observed something," I said at last. Unable to contain my curiosity, Holmes allowed a faint smile. "My dear Watson, I observed possibility. Whether it resolves itself into fact remains to be seen." "That is not an answer," I replied. "It is the only one available at present," he said calmly. "But let us turn our attention to matters that may be examined with greater certainty." He rose once more and approached the table, where the parcel lay undisturbed. This time, however, he did not immediately reach for it. Instead, he circled the table slowly, viewing it from several angles, as though it were not a simple object, but the center of a problem whose boundaries extended beyond what the eye could perceive. you will recall. Watson, he began, that the sender has specified that I alone am to open this package. Yes, and you will further recall that no explanation accompanies that instruction. That is true. Holmes nodded slightly. Then we must ask ourselves why such specificity. To ensure that you are the one who encounters whatever lies within, I suggested. Holmes raised a finger. Precisely. And that, in itself, is most revealing. In what way? Holmes turned toward me. It suggests that the contents are not merely intended to be seen, but to be interpreted by a particular mind. You believe this is directed at you personally? I do not believe it. Watson and I consider it certain. There was no vanity in his tone, only the quiet statement of a fact. He leaned slightly closer to the parcel, though still refraining from touching it. Such a communication implies prior knowledge, he continued. The sender knows my methods, anticipates my reactions, and has arranged matters accordingly, and that makes him dangerous. Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. On the contrary, yet makes him interesting. I could not help but shake my head. You treat this as a puzzle, Holmes. Yet we do not know that it is safe even to approach it. Which is precisely why we shall not approach it blindly, he replied, at last. He extended his hand, but instead of touching the parcel, he took up a thin metal probe from his instrument case and used it to gently lift one edge of the wrapping. The movement was so delicate that it produced no sound. Observe, he said. I leaned closer. Beneath the paper, the outline of a small wooden box became visible, smooth, dark, and unmarked. No label, I said. No inscription. Which suggests intention rather than omission, Holmes replied. Anonymity is rarely accidental in such cases. He withdrew the probe and stepped back. There are no immediate signs of mechanical contrivance, no tension in the wrapping. No indication of internal pressure. If it is a device, it is a subtle one, and if it is not, Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. Then we must consider alternatives, chemical, psychological, or symbolic. Symbolic. I repeated. Holmes turned slightly, his gaze drifting once more toward the fire. A gift, Watson, he said, or at least something presented in the form of one. Yet the circumstances of its delivery contradict that notion entirely. It arrives unannounced at an unusual hour, with instructions that impose both urgency and exclusivity. Then it is not a gift at all. Holmes inclined his head. It is a message, though not one conveyed in words. At that moment, there came another knock at the door, firmer this time, and accompanied by the unmistakable tread of official authority. Mrs. Hudson entered shortly thereafter, followed by Inspector Lestrade, whose expression bore the marks of haste and concern. Holmes, he said, without preamble. I thought I might find you here. You usually do, Inspector. Holmes replied mildly. 2. What do we owe the pleasure of your visit? Lestrade glanced briefly at the parcel upon the table. I've come about a matter that may interest you. A rather peculiar death, earlier this evening. Holmes' attention sharpened at once. Indeed. A gentleman found in his study, Lestrade continued. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no poison that we can detect. He was seated at his desk as though he had simply stopped. I felt a familiar chill. And you connect this with our present situation? Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. This was found in the room, he said, handing it over, addressed to no one in particular. Holmes opened it and read silently. I watched his expression closely and saw at once the subtle shift, the tightening of the lips, the faint narrowing of the eyes that signaled the recognition of something significant. Well? I asked. Holmes handed me the paper. Upon it were written only a few words. The gift was accepted. I looked up in alarm. You think? Holmes' voice was quiet, but firm. "I think, Watson, that we are no longer dealing with a hypothetical danger." Lestrade gestured toward the parcel. "That arrived tonight." "It did, and you haven't opened it." Holmes shook his head. "No." Lestrade let out a low breath. "Then I'd advise you not to." "Not until we know more." Holmes' eyes flickered briefly with something that might almost have been amusement. "My dear Inspector," he said, "that is precisely my intention." He turned once more to the parcel, his expression now entirely changed. Where before there had been curiosity, there was now certainty. "The game," he said quietly, "has already begun." "And the man who died?" I asked. Holmes' gaze remained fixed upon the unopened box. "He made the first move," he replied. A silence followed, heavy with implication. "And we," I said slowly, "are the next." Holmes did not deny it. Instead, he stepped closer to the table once more. His eyes locked upon the object that had so suddenly become the center of a deadly design. "Then we must proceed," he said, with a degree of caution commensurate with the intelligence of our opponent. Lestrade crossed his arms. "And just how intelligent do you think he is?" Holmes' lips curved slightly. "Intelligent enough," he said, "to know that I will not resist the temptation to understand him." He paused, then added softly, "and dangerous enough to ensure that, in doing so, I place myself precisely where he wishes me to be." As I looked from Holmes to the silent parcel upon the table, and then to the grim expression of Inspector Lestrade, I felt once more that deepening sense of unease that we stood at the threshold of a mystery not merely to be solved, but to be survived. Within the hour, we found ourselves conveyed through the fog-laden streets of London to the residence of the deceased gentleman, whose sudden and inexplicable death had so urgently drawn Inspector Lestrade to Baker Street. The carriage wheels moved with a muffled rhythm over the damp road, and the world beyond the glass seemed little more than a shifting veil of pale light and shadow. Holmes spoke scarcely a word during the journey, yet I could see from the fixed intensity of his expression that his mind was already deeply engaged with the implications of what we had learned. The house in question stood in a respectable, though somewhat secluded, square, a tall, narrow structure of dark brick, its windows dimly lit and its entrance attended by a constable who admitted us without delay. Within, the atmosphere was one of subdued alarm. Servants moved quietly, their voices hushed, as though the very walls retained some awareness of the event that had transpired. "This way," said Lestrade, leading us toward the rear of the house. "We've left everything as it was found." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A most commendable precaution." We were shown into the study, a room of moderate size, lined with bookshelves and furnished with a heavy writing desk near the window. At first glance, nothing appeared amiss. The chair stood in place, the desk neatly arranged, the fire low but still burning. Yet there was, from the moment of our entrance, that same indefinable quality I had encountered before, a stillness, not merely of sound, but of sensation itself, as though the room existed in a state of unnatural equilibrium. Holmes paused just within the threshold. "Do not advance too quickly, Watson," he said quietly. I halted at once. "You perceive it as well?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head. "Most distinctly." Lestrade looked between us with mild impatience. "I see nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "Man sits at his desk, dies without a mark, that's all there is to it." Holmes' lips curved faintly. "And yet, Inspector, it is precisely what you do not see that concerns me." He stepped forward with deliberate care, his movements measured, as though each footfall were placed with calculation. I followed at a cautious distance, while Lestrade remained nearer the door. "The body was here," Lestrade continued, indicating the chair before the desk. "Slumped forward. No signs of distress." Holmes bent slightly, examining the chair without touching it. "No displacement," he murmured. no indication of sudden movement. The posture suggests an interruption rather than a reaction. He straightened and turned his attention to the desk itself. Papers lay arranged in orderly fashion, an inkstand positioned precisely to one side, and a pen resting neatly across a sheet that bore no writing. Curious, Holmes said softly, "What is it?" I asked. "The absence of interruption," he replied. "A man engaged in writing does not, as a rule, pause so completely without cause." Lestrade shrugged. Perhaps he was thinking. Holmes glanced at him. A possibility, though I should prefer to know what he was thinking. He moved slowly around the desk, his eyes noting each detail with meticulous care. At length, his gaze fell upon an object placed near the far edge of the surface. It was a box. I felt an immediate and unmistakable chill, for the object bore a striking resemblance to the parcel we had left behind at Baker Street, though this one was already unwrapped, revealing a small, dark wooden case, its lid slightly raised. "There," said Lestrade. "That's what caught our attention. We thought it might be connected." Holmes approached it with evident interest, though he maintained a careful distance. "You have not touched it?" he asked. "No." "Excellent." Holmes leaned slightly forward, examining the box with intense scrutiny. "The lid is not fully open," he observed. "It rests at an intermediate angle." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning that the act was begun but not completed." Lestrade frowned. "You think he was opening it when he died?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his attention to the surrounding space, the position of the chair, the distance to the desk, the angle of the window. "Perhaps," he said at last. "But that alone would be insufficient to explain the result." He moved to the window, inspecting the frame and latch with equal care. "Closed," he murmured, "and recently so. No sign of external interference." The fog beyond pressed thickly against the glass, rendering the outside world indistinct. "Holmes," I said quietly, "this resembles the situation we discussed earlier." "Indeed, Watson," he replied. "It does more than resemble, it confirms it." Lestrade stepped closer. "Confirms what?" Holmes turned back toward the room, his expression now sharpened with purpose. "That we are dealing with a deliberate design," he said. "One in which the victim is placed within a specific set of conditions which, when fulfilled, produce a fatal effect." Lestrade shook his head. "You're suggesting this man died because of how the room is arranged." "I am suggesting," Holmes replied calmly, "that the arrangement is not accidental." He moved once more toward the desk and, with the utmost care, adjusted his position slightly, no more than a fraction, before pausing. "Do not come closer," he said sharply. As I instinctively took a step forward, I halted at once. "What is it?" Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed upon the space before him. "Remarkable," he murmured. A moment later, he stepped back quickly. The change was subtle, yet unmistakable. The oppressive stillness seemed to lift slightly, as though some invisible tension had been released. Holmes exhaled softly. "It is as I feared," he said. Lestrade looked increasingly uneasy. "What is—" Holmes gestured toward the room as a whole. "The effect is not confined to the object," he said. "It extends to the environment." I felt a growing sense of dread. "You mean the box is not the cause?" Holmes' gaze returned to it. "No," he said quietly. "It is merely the key." A silence followed. "And the lock?" I asked. Holmes' expression grew grave. "The lock, Watson," he replied, "is the arrangement of the room itself." Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That's a fine theory, but how does it kill a man?" Holmes turned toward him, his eyes bright with a mixture of intensity and restraint. "That," he said, "is the very question our adversary intends us to ask." He moved then to the edge of the desk and, with great care, lowered the lid of the box until it rested closed. "There," he said. "We shall not complete what has already begun." Lestrade folded his arms. "And what now?" Holmes glanced once more around the room, committing every detail to memory. "Now," he said, "we return to Baker Street." "And leave this as it is?" Lestrade asked. "For the present, yes." Holmes moved toward the door, pausing only briefly at the threshold. "For I believe," he added quietly, "that this is but the first of several such demonstrations." I followed him out, though not without casting one last glance at the silent study behind us. The room appeared unchanged, orderly, undisturbed, entirely ordinary. And yet, I could not escape the conviction that we had just stood within a mechanism as precise as any. Clockwork hand, far more deadly dot, as we stepped back into the fog-filled night. Holmes spoke once more, his voice low but resolute. "The gift has indeed been accepted," he said. "And now," he added, "it is our turn to decide how it shall be returned." Our return to Baker Street was marked by a silence more profound than any that had preceded it. The fog seemed thicker than before, as though London itself had drawn a veil over the events of the night, concealing their meaning while amplifying their menace. Holmes remained withdrawn during the journey, his long fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed upon nothing visible, yet clearly tracing some internal chain of reasoning whose complexity I could scarcely imagine upon entering our rooms. His attention returned at once to the parcel which lay precisely where we had left it. It appeared unchanged, innocent, almost mundane yet now. In light of what we had witnessed, it carried a weight far beyond its modest form. It was no longer merely a curiosity. It was a counterpart to death. Holmes removed his coat and hat with deliberate care before approaching the table. For several moments he stood in silence, studying the parcel as though comparing it, detail by detail, with the box we had seen in the study. "You observe the similarity," he said at last. "Yes," I replied. "It appears identical in size and construction." "Not merely similar," Holmes corrected quietly. "It is intentional replication. You believe it comes from the same source. I have no doubt of it." He circled the table once more, his movements slow and measured. "The first box was opened, or nearly so, by a man who died without cause. This one has been delivered to me with the express instruction that I should open it. The parallel is too precise to be accidental." "And yet," I said, "you have chosen not to do so." Holmes glanced at me, his expression faintly amused. "My dear Watson, if a man invites me to place my hand within a trap, I do not oblige him out of courtesy." Before I could respond, there came a firm knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade once more, though this time he was not alone. With him stood a tall, thin gentleman of nervous bearing, whose pale face and restless eyes suggested a mind under considerable strain. "Holmes," said Lestrade, "I've brought someone who may be of interest to you. Mr. Edwin Carruthers, the secretary to the deceased." The man stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Mr. Holmes, I am most relieved to make your acquaintance, though I regret deeply the circumstances which have led to it." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray be seated. Mr. Carruthers, you were present in the house this evening?" "Yes, sir." "I was in the adjoining room when it occurred, or rather, when it must have occurred." "I heard nothing." "Nothing at all." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Nothing unusual." "No sound, no disturbance." "None whatsoever." "When I entered the study, I found my employer, as you have described, seated, motionless, as though life had simply departed." Holmes gestured lightly. "And the box?" Carruthers hesitated. "It had arrived earlier that afternoon. A delivery, much like the one you have received, I believe." Holmes' gaze flickered briefly toward our own parcel. "Was it opened immediately?" "No, sir." "My employer remarked upon it, but set it aside. He intended, I believe, to examine it later in the evening. And when you discovered him? The lid was slightly raised, as Inspector Lestrade has noted. Holmes regarded him steadily. You seem remarkably certain of your recollection. Mr. Carruthers. The man shifted uneasily. I have gone over the events repeatedly in my mind. It is all most distressing. Quite so, Holmes said softly. There was a pause, during which Holmes' keen eyes rested upon the man with increasing intensity. I had seen that look before. Was the look he wore when a detail, however small, had caught his attention. You were his secretary, Holmes continued. You would have had access to his correspondence, his appointments, his personal affairs. Yes, sir. Then perhaps you can inform us, had your employer any enemies? Carruthers hesitated once more. None that I am aware of. He was a quiet man, devoted to his work. And what was the nature of that work? Mathematics, sir. Abstract theory, for the most part. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. Indeed, he murmured. And did he ever speak of receiving unusual communications, anonymous parcels, perhaps? Carruthers' reaction was immediate, though subtle, a slight tightening of the jaw, a fleeting shift of the eyes. No, sir, he said quickly. Nothing of the kind. Holmes leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Curious, he said. For such a parcel did, in fact, arrive, and you, as his secretary, were unaware of any prior indication of it. Carruthers' composure faltered for the briefest instant. It was unexpected. As was his death, Holmes replied. Lestrade, who had been observing the exchange with growing interest, now stepped forward. Holmes, are you suggesting? Holmes raised a hand slightly. I am suggesting nothing yet, he said calmly. I am merely observing. He rose and moved slowly toward Carruthers, his gaze never leaving the man's face. You were the first to discover the body, he said. Yes, you handled nothing. Nothing. You did not approach the desk. I know, sir. Holmes stopped a short distance from him, and yet, he said quietly, you are able to describe the position of the box, the state of its lid, and the arrangement of the room with remarkable precision. Carruthers swallowed. I noticed these things at a glance. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Did you indeed? A silence fell, heavy with implication. Lestrade's expression hardened. Mr. Carruthers, he said, you'd best be very clear in your answers. The man's composure now visibly strained. I have told you everything I know. Holmes turned away slightly, as though losing interest. Perhaps, he said lightly. And yet, Inspector, we are presented here with a most convenient circumstance. In what way? Lestrade asked. Holmes gestured faintly toward Carruthers, a man in close proximity to the victim, possessed of knowledge of his habits, present at the time of death, and displaying a degree of awareness that borders upon the anticipatory. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You think he's involved? Holmes shrugged faintly. It would be a most natural conclusion. Carruthers sprang to his feet. This is absurd. I have done nothing at all. Holmes regarded him calmly. My dear sir, I have accused you of nothing. I merely observe that the facts, as they present themselves, form a pattern, and you believe I am part of it. Holmes' expression remained unreadable. I believe, he said, that you fit it very well. The man's agitation grew. This is madness. Inspector, you cannot seriously. Lestrade held up a hand. Sit down, Mr. Carruthers. Reluctantly, the man complied. Holmes turned back toward the table, his attention once more upon the unopened parcel. You see, Watson, he said quietly, how readily the mind seizes upon the most apparent explanation. You mean Carruthers. I mean the appearance of guilt, Holmes replied. He paused, then added, which is often the most carefully constructed illusion of all. I looked at him sharply. You do not believe he is responsible? Holmes' lips curved slightly. On the contrary, he said, I believe he is precisely what he appears to be, and that is? Holmes' gaze rested once more upon the silent parcel. A solution, he said softly, that is almost too perfect to be true. The implication of his words settled upon me slowly, and with it came a renewed sense of unease. For if the most obvious suspect was indeed a deception, then the true architect of this deadly design remained, not only unseen, but entirely beyond our immediate reach, and the unopened gift upon our table waited still. The tension within Baker Street that night did not abate with the departure of Mr. Carruthers. Rather, it deepened into something more subtle and far more dangerous, quiet uncertainty which seemed to linger in every corner of the room. Inspector Lestrade, though outwardly composed, had clearly not dismissed Holmes' earlier observations, while I myself found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the apparent clarity of the evidence with the faint but persistent doubt Holmes had so deliberately introduced. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unaffected by this atmosphere. He had resumed his place by the fire, his long frame partially reclined, his eyes closed as though in rest. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize that this was not idleness, but concentration of the most intense kind. His mind, no doubt, was engaged in the silent ordering of facts, testing, discarding, and reconstructing them until the hidden structure of the problem revealed itself at length. Without opening his eyes, he spoke. Watson, you are troubled. I confess that I am, I replied. The evidence against Carruthers is compelling his proximity, his knowledge, his behavior, yet you seem to dismiss it entirely. Holmes opened his eyes slowly. I do not dismiss it, he said. I question it. In what respect? Holmes rose and crossed to the table, where the unopened parcel still lay undisturbed. In its perfection, he replied. I frowned. Perfection is not usually a flaw. On the contrary, Holmes said quietly, it is often the most significant one. He gestured toward the parcel. Consider the parallel between this object and the one found in the study. Both are identical in form, both arrive without explanation, and both invite the same action. Yet the outcome in each case depends not upon the object itself, but upon the behavior it provokes. You mean the victim completes the trap? Precisely. Holmes began pacing slowly. Now consider Mr. Carruthers. He is present at the scene, possesses detailed knowledge of the circumstances, and exhibits just enough nervousness to attract suspicion, yet not so much as to appear contrived, which makes him a likely suspect. Too likely, Holmes corrected. He paused, then added, our adversary, Watson, is a man of considerable intellect, one who designs not merely actions, but interpretations. He anticipates not only what will occur, but how it will be understood. I felt a growing clarity. You believe Carruthers is meant to be suspected? Holmes inclined his head. Exactly. Inspector Lestrade, who had been listening with increasing interest, stepped forward. Then what you're saying is someone arranged matters so that this man would appear guilty. Holmes smiled faintly. You grasp it perfectly. Inspector Lestrade frowned. But why go to such trouble? If the aim is to kill, why not do so and leave it at that? Holmes' eyes gleamed. Because the aim is not merely to kill, it is to control the narrative that follows, to direct attention toward a false conclusion, thereby concealing the true mechanism. He moved once more to the table and, with great care, examined the parcel without touching it. There is, however, a detail which undermines this carefully constructed illusion, he continued. What detail? I asked. Holmes turned toward me. The timing? Lestrade raised an eyebrow. In what way? Holmes spoke with quiet precision. The parcel at Baker Street arrived after the death of the first victim. Yet the message found in the study, the gift was accepted, suggests that the act had already been completed. I consider this. Then, the sender knew the outcome before sending the second parcel. Exactly, Holmes said, which implies not only foresight, but control over the sequence of events. Lestrade crossed his arms. You're saying he knew the man would die before it happened? I am saying, Holmes replied, that he arranged matters in such a way that the outcome was inevitable. A silence followed, and Carruthers? I asked. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. Carruthers reacts to events, but he does not shape them. His knowledge, though precise, is retrospective. He describes what has occurred, not what is to come. Then he cannot be the architect. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Lestrade exhaled slowly, which puts us back at the beginning. On the contrary, Holmes said, it moves us forward. He returned to his chair and seated himself. His fingers once more steepled, for we now know that the true culprit is not merely present at the scene, but absent from suspicion. He operates at a distance, constructing conditions rather than performing actions. I felt a chill. Man who kills without being there. Holmes' gaze shifted briefly toward the window, or who ensures that his presence is never required. The room fell silent once more. And what of the parcel? I asked. If it is part of the same design, then it too must serve a purpose. Holmes looked at it intently. Indeed, it does. And that purpose? Holmes' voice lowered slightly. To draw me into the pattern. The words struck me with sudden force. You meant is meant for you to become the next victim. Holmes' expression remained calm. It is meant, he said, for me to take the place of the previous subject to complete the sequence, and thereby validate the design. Lestrade stepped forward sharply. Then you mustn't touch it. Not under any circumstances. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, if I were to avoid every danger presented to me, I should have very little occupation. This is no ordinary danger, Lestrade insisted. Holmes inclined his head. On that point, we are in complete agreement. He rose once more and approached the parcel, his gaze steady and unwavering. The question, therefore, he continued, is not whether it is dangerous, but how that danger is achieved. And you intend to find out, I said. Holmes turned toward me, and in his eyes I saw that unmistakable spark, the one that had carried him through so many perilous adventures. I intend, he said quietly, to understand it completely. He paused, then added, for only then may we hope to defeat it. I felt a deep unease at his words, for I knew well what such understanding often required. And how, I asked, do you propose to do that? Holmes' gaze returned to the parcel, by identifying the precise inconsistency upon which the entire design depends. Inconsistency, Lestrade repeated. Holmes nodded. Every system, however elegant, contains within it a point of weakness, a detail overlooked, a condition imperfectly controlled. Our task is to find that flaw, and if there is none, I asked quietly. Holmes' lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. Then, he said, we shall be obliged to create one. The fire flickered softly as his words settled upon us, and I could not help but feel that we had crossed some invisible threshold, that the case had passed from observation into confrontation, and at the center of it all, the unopened gift remained waiting. The following morning dawned gray and reluctant, as though even the light itself hesitated to fully reveal the city after the events of the previous night. Yet Holmes was already awake and engaged before I had risen, his restless energy having returned with renewed intensity. When I entered the sitting room, I found him at the table, the unopened parcel before him, surrounded now by an array of instruments, lenses, measuring tools, and a small chemical apparatus, each placed with deliberate precision. You have not slept, I observed. Holmes did not look up. Sleep, my dear Watson, is a luxury reserved for those who are not in the midst of an intellectual contest. And you consider this such a contest? Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. I consider it a correspondence of minds, one in which each move demands a reply. He straightened and gestured toward the parcel. I have spent the better part of the night examining every accessible submersible aspect of this object. Its construction is simple, its materials unremarkable, and yet it is undeniably connected to a sequence of events which defy ordinary explanation. And you have discovered nothing further. On the contrary, he replied, I have discovered something most instructive, namely, that the object itself is not the source of danger. I took a step closer, though still mindful of his earlier cautions. Then your earlier theory stands. The danger lies in the arrangement. Precisely. At that moment, there came a rapid knock at the door, followed by the hurried entrance of Inspector Lestrade, whose expression bore unmistakable signs of urgency. Holmes, he said, there's been another one. Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. Another death. Lestrade nodded grimly. Early this morning. A clerk, young fellow, works in a counting house near the river, found in a back office. Same as before, no marks, no signs of struggle, just gone. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, and the circumstances. Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated, then added, there was a box. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though confirming a conclusion already reached. Of course there was. And a note, Lestrade continued, producing a folded slip of paper. Same hand as before. Holmes took it and read silently. He then handed it to me. The message was brief. The pattern improves. A silence followed, heavier than any that had preceded it. Holmes spoke first. Then our adversary is not merely repeating his experiment, he is refining it. Lestrade exhaled sharply. This is getting out of hand, Holmes. 2 deaths in less than a day and no sign of how it's done. Holmes' expression remained composed, though I could detect beneath it a growing intensity. On the contrary, Inspector, we have every sign of how it is done. What we lack is the final element which completes the sequence. And what is that? I asked. Holmes turned toward me. Control over the conditions, he said. In each case, the victim is placed within a carefully constructed environment, one in which their own actions bring about the fatal result. Lestrade shook his head. You're telling me these men killed themselves? Without knowing it, I'm telling you, Holmes replied, that they were guided subtly, precisely into positions from which there was no safe outcome. He began pacing, his thoughts now moving with visible speed. The first victim, a man of intellect, inclined to examine the object. The second, a clerk, likely curious, perhaps less cautious, yet equally susceptible to suggestion. In both instances, the presence of the box initiates the sequence, but it is the response of the individual that completes it. And now there are 2, I said, which means the pattern is becoming more reliable. Holmes inclined his head. Exactly. He stopped abruptly, and, therefore, more dangerous. Lestrade stepped forward. Then we need to stop him, find this man, and put an end to it. Holmes' gaze lifted. And how do you propose to do so, Inspector? Lestrade hesitated. Well, we track the deliveries. The messenger knows nothing. Holmes interrupted gently. The parcels are prepared elsewhere, dispatched through intermediaries, and delivered without traceable origin. Our adversary has ensured that every direct line of inquiry leads only to another dead end. Lestrade frowned. Then what do you suggest? Holmes' expression grew intent. We must cease reacting to his actions, instead anticipate them. And how do we do that? I asked. Holmes turned slowly toward the parcel upon the table. By understanding the progression of his design, he said, Each death is not merely a repetition, it is an improvement. A refinement of the conditions, a reduction of variables, an increase in efficiency. And what does that lead to? I said quietly. Holmes. Voice lowered. It leads to a point at which the pattern may be reproduced with minimal effort, tanned maximum. Certainty. A chill passed through me. You mean he is perfecting? A method of killing that leaves no trace and requires no presence. Holmes met my gaze precisely. The gravity of this realization seemed to settle upon all of us at once. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. This is madness. Holmes shook his head slightly. No. Inspector, it is method. He moved once more to the table, his eyes fixed upon the unopened parcel. And we, he continued, have been provided with the next step in that method. You mean this is the next test? I said. Holmes nodded double quotes, yes. The next demonstration, one designed not merely to replicate the previous results, but to surpass them. Lestrade stepped forward quickly. Then we destroy it. Burn it, smash it, whatever it takes. Holmes raised a hand. No. Lestrade stared at him. No. Holmes' voice was calm, but firm. If we destroy it, we learn nothing. And if we learn nothing, we remain at the mercy of a design we do not fully understand. Better that than risk another death, Lestrade insisted. Holmes' gaze hardened slightly. On the contrary, Inspector, it is precisely by understanding the risk that we may prevent further deaths. He paused, then added, our adversary believes himself unassailable. He operates through abstraction, through distance, through the manipulation of conditions rather than direct action. He assumes that we will remain confined within the boundaries of ordinary reasoning. And you intend to step outside those boundaries, I said. Holmes' lips curved faintly. I intend, he said, to meet him on his own ground. A silence followed. And how, I asked, do you propose to do that? Holmes looked once more at the parcel, his expression now one of quiet determination. By allowing the pattern to proceed, he said. Lestrade reacted at once. That's out of the set. Question. Holmes turned toward him. Not uncontrolled, he said. But under conditions of our choosing. You mean to recreate the situation? Exactly. I felt a surge of alarm. Holmes, that would place you in direct danger. He inclined his head. Slightly, undoubtedly. And yet you intend to do it. Holmes met my gaze steadily. It is the only way to identify the precise moment at which the pattern becomes lethal and, therefore, the only way to interrupt it. Lestrade shook his head. You're talking about using yourself as bait. Holmes' expression remained calm. I am talking about transforming uncertainty into knowledge. He paused, then added quietly, for until we understand the mechanism completely, we remain one step behind a man who has already demonstrated his willingness to kill without hesitation. The room fell silent once more. Outside, the fog still clung to the streets as though unwilling to release its hold upon the city. And within, the unopened parcel remained at the center of our attention, no longer merely a threat, but the key to a design that was growing more precise, more efficient, and far more deadly with each passing hour. I shall never forget the singular determination with which Holmes set about the execution of his plan. For it was evident from the outset that he had resolved not merely to observe the pattern, but to seize control of it entirely. Where before he had been cautious, measuring, analyzing, withholding action, he now moved with a quiet decisiveness that admitted no hesitation. The contest, as he had described it, had reached a stage at which passivity was no longer an option. By late afternoon, our sitting room at Baker Street had been transformed into something altogether different from its usual character. The furniture, ordinarily arranged with a view to comfort, had been shifted into precise positions, each alteration dictated not by convenience, but by calculation. Holmes worked with meticulous care, consulting his notes repeatedly, measuring distances, adjusting angles, and even directing the placement of the curtains so that the light entered the room in a narrow, controlled band. "You see, Watson," he said, as he marked a point upon the carpet with a small piece of chalk, "we must reproduce not merely the appearance of the previous environments, but their conditions. It is not enough that the objects resemble those in the study, we must also account for space, stillness, and proportion. And you are certain these details are essential?" I asked. Holmes straightened, his expression intent. "I am certain that they are not accidental." Inspector Lestrade, who had remained throughout with visible unease, watched these preparations with increasing concern. "This is all very well, Holmes," he said, "but you're building the very trap we're trying to avoid." Holmes glanced at him calmly. "On the contrary, Inspector, I am reconstructing it in order to understand its limits. And if you miscalculate those limits—" Holmes' lips curved faintly. "Then I shall have the misfortune of confirming our adversary's theory." Lestrade did not appear reassured. When all was arranged to Holmes' satisfaction, the parcel was brought forward and placed at the exact position he had determined. He handled it with great care, though not with fear, with the controlled precision of a man who understood both the risk and the necessity of his actions. "There," he'd said quietly. The fixed point felt an involuntary tightening in my chest. "And now?" I asked. Holmes turned toward me, his expression composed, though there was in his eyes a brightness that betrayed the intensity of his thoughts. "Now we complete the conditions," he said. He moved to one of the marked positions upon the floor and stood there, adjusting his posture slightly, as though aligning himself with some invisible structure. The effect upon the room was immediate and deeply unsettling. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence more pronounced, until even the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece became conspicuously loud. "Do you perceive it?" Holmes asked. "Yes," I replied. "It is the same sensation as in the study." "Exactly." He shifted his position by a fraction. "And now?" The change, though slight, was unmistakable. The oppressive quality diminished, as though some delicate balance had been altered. Holmes nodded. "The threshold is narrow," he said. "Extremely narrow." Lestrade stepped forward anxiously. "Holmes, this is dangerous." Holmes raised a hand without turning. "Remain where you are, Inspector. A single misplaced step may produce consequences we are not yet prepared to observe." He then did something which caused my heart to quicken considerably. He reached toward the parcel and began, with slow and deliberate movements, to loosen the twine. "Holmes," I exclaimed. He did not look at me. "Steady, Watson. This is the critical stage." The paper fell away, revealing the small wooden box beneath, identical in every respect to the one we had seen in the study. Its surface was smooth, unmarked, and entirely unremarkable. Yet in that moment it seemed to command the entire space around it. Holmes adjusted his stance once more, aligning himself precisely with the marks he had made. "Observe carefully," he said, "for we now approach the point at which the pattern becomes active. With the utmost care." He placed his fingers upon the lid. The room seemed to contract. I became acutely aware of every detail: the faint glow of the fire, the muted light from the window, the absolute stillness that had settled upon us like a weight. Holmes lifted the lid. Only slightly. He paused. Nothing happened. A breath I had not realized I was holding escaped me quietly. Holmes' expression, however, remained unchanged. "Not yet," he murmured. He shifted his position no more than an inch hand then. Once again raised the lid slightly further. This time I felt it done. It was not a sound nor a movement. but a subtle and deeply unsettling alteration in the atmosphere, as though the air itself had become charged with an invisible tension. Holmes froze. "There," he said softly, "for a fleeting instant, I perceived something I can only describe as a distortion of faint trembling in the space between Holmes and the box, as though the very fabric of the air had been disturbed." Holmes stepped back. I cried, but he did not move. Instead, he leaned ever so slightly forward, and in that moment I understood the full extent of his daring. He was not merely observing the pattern, he was entering it. "Holmes!" Lestrade shouted at once. Holmes withdrew his hand and stepped back sharply. The effect vanished instantly. The oppressive stillness lifted. The air seemed to return to its natural state, and the room once more became ordinary. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Holmes closed the lid of the box gently and stepped away from the table, his expression one of quiet triumph. "It is confirmed," he said. I approached him quickly. "Confirmed." "You nearly, on the contrary, Watson," he said calmly. "I have determined the precise conditions under which the effect manifests sand. More importantly, the limits beyond which it does." Not Lestrade shook his head in disbelief. "You're risking your life for a theory." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "I am refining it into certainty." He turned back toward the box. "Our adversary relies upon the victim's ignorance pawn, their unawareness of the delicate balance required. A slight misalignment, a fraction of movement, and the effect fails to occur." "And you have found that margin?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed." He paused, then added, "And in doing so, we have gained something far more valuable than safety." "What is that?" I asked. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Control." A silence followed. "And what do you intend to do with it?" Lestrade asked. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. "I intend," he said slowly, "to use it as a means of drawing our adversary into the open." "You think he is watching?" I said. Holmes glanced briefly toward the window. "I think," he replied, "that a mind such as his would not entrust so delicate a design to chance. He will wish to observe its success or its failure." Lestrade moved toward the door. "Then we set a watch." "Quietly." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." He turned once more to the box, now closed and silent upon the table. "The pattern has been understood," he said quietly. "Now it must be turned." As I looked upon him in that moment, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the edge of the final movement in a most dangerous game, one in which Holmes had willingly placed himself at the center, not as a victim, but as a player prepared to match, move for move, the mind that had conceived it all. It was shortly after nightfall that Holmes declared his preparations complete, and I must confess that never had I seen him so composed in the face of such calculated danger. The transformation of our sitting room into a precise reconstruction of the fatal pattern was now absolute. Every object stood in its measured place, every angle and distance determined with mathematical exactitude. Even the fire had been reduced to a low, steady glow, its crackle subdued so as not to disturb the delicate equilibrium upon which Holmes insisted the entire mechanism depended. Outside, the fog had returned with renewed density, pressing against the windows and swallowing the street in a suffocating stillness. It was, as Holmes observed, an ideal night for observation, whether ours or that of the unseen adversary who had thus far remained beyond our reach. "You are certain he will come?" I asked, unable to conceal the tension in my voice. Holmes, who stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, did not immediately reply. "I am certain," he said at last, "that he will not be able to resist the temptation to witness his design." To verify it, Holmes corrected. "A mind such as his does not rely upon assumption. It seeks confirmation. Inspector Lestrade had stationed his men discreetly along the street below, concealed within the shadows and instructed to act only upon Holmes' signal. The arrangement, though carefully executed, added little to my sense of security, for I was acutely aware that the danger we faced did not reside in any visible threat. But in the very air we occupied, Holmes turned from the window and approached the table, where the box lay once more at the center of our constructed environment. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "we must proceed with the final stage. You intend to recreate the effect again?" I asked. "Not merely recreate it," Holmes replied, "but sustain it long enough to compel observation." The implication of this was deeply unsettling. "You mean to place yourself within the pattern and remain there?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Only to the precise limit at which the effect becomes perceptible," he said. "Beyond that, I shall not venture." Lestrade, who had been listening with increasing unease, stepped forward. "This is madness, Holmes. You're giving him exactly what he wants." Holmes met his gaze calmly. "On the contrary, Inspector, I am giving him what he expects. There is a difference, and that difference is—" Holmes' eyes flickered with quiet intensity, "that I shall not behave as his previous subjects have done." He then moved into position, aligning himself once more with the markings upon the floor. His posture was exact, his movements controlled to the smallest degree, as though he were entering not a room but a carefully defined equation. "Observe closely," he said. He placed his hand upon the lid of the box and, with deliberate care, began to raise it at once. The change returned. The stillness deepened, pressing inward with a force that seemed almost tangible. The faint sounds of the room, the ticking clock, the distant murmur of the street fell away into a profound and unnatural silence. Even my own breathing seemed intrusive, as though it violated some unseen boundary. Holmes held his position. "There," he murmured. I saw it again, that subtle distortion in the air, like a faint ripple passing through an otherwise invisible medium. Seconds passed. Holmes did not move. "Holmes," I said quietly, "that is enough." He raised a hand slightly, signaling me to remain silent. Another moment passed, and then, from beyond the window, there came the faintest of movements. Holmes' eyes shifted not to the box, but to the glass. "He is there," he said softly. Lestrade reacted at once, moving toward the door. "Now?" he whispered. "Not yet," Holmes replied, his voice barely audible. He maintained the position for one final moment, just long enough, I realized, to ensure that the effect was unmistakable to any observer. Then, with sudden precision, he lowered the lid and stepped back. The oppressive stillness vanished instantly. "Now," Holmes said. Lestrade wasted no time. He signaled to his men below, and within seconds there came the sound of hurried footsteps and a brief struggle in the street. I moved to the window, my heart racing, and through the thinning veil of fog I glimpsed the shadowed forms of officers converging upon a single figure who had been standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. "He's taken," Lestrade said, returning moments later with visible satisfaction. "Tried to slip away, but we were too quick for him." Holmes, however, did not share his immediate triumph. He stood quietly by the table, his gaze fixed upon the now closed box, as though considering not the man who had been captured, but the mind that had sent him. "Bring him up," Holmes said at last. The man was ushered into the room shortly thereafter, thin, sharp-featured individual whose expression, though outwardly composed, betrayed a certain unease beneath its surface. His eyes moved quickly, taking in the arrangement of the room, the box upon the table, and finally Holmes himself. "Well," said Lestrade, "you've been keeping an interest in our proceedings. Perhaps you'd care to explain why." The man said nothing. Holmes stepped forward slightly, his manner calm, almost conversational. "You have observed enough," he said quietly. "You know that the pattern has been understood. for a flicker passed across the man's face, so slight that it might easily have been missed. "You are not the architect," Holmes continued. "But you are close enough to him to recognize that this experiment has reached its conclusion." The man's lips tightened. "I have nothing to say." Holmes inclined his head. "As you wish." He turned away, as though dismissing the matter entirely. Lestrade frowned. "That's it. You're not going to question him." Holmes' expression was thoughtful. "Oh, I shall question him," he said. "But not here and not now." He glanced once more at the prisoner. "For the moment, it is sufficient that he has seen what he was meant to see. And what is that?" I asked. Holmes' eyes met mine. "That his master's design," he said quietly, "is no longer beyond our reach." A silence followed, broken only by the distant sounds of the street as the fog began, at last, to lift. Yet as I looked upon the captured man, I could not escape the uneasy conviction that we had seized only a fragment of the truth, that the true architect of this dark and intricate scheme remained unseen, and that the game, though advanced, had not yet reached its final move. Holmes, it seemed, shared that conviction, for even in that moment of apparent success, his gaze held not satisfaction but anticipation. The prisoner, whose capture had been effected with such efficiency under Holmes' direction, was removed shortly thereafter under the supervision of Inspector Lestrade. Yet Holmes himself made no immediate attempt to interrogate him. This, I confess, struck me as most unusual, for in previous cases he had rarely delayed when an opportunity for direct inquiry presented itself. Instead, he resumed his place by the fire, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed in that familiar attitude of deep reflection. "You are not satisfied," I said at length. Holmes opened his eyes slightly. "On the contrary, Watson, I am confirmed." "Confirmed of what?" "That we have not yet reached the center of the matter." He rose and crossed slowly to the window, gazing out upon the street, where the last remnants of fog drifted in pale, shifting strands beneath the lamplight. "The man we have captured," he continued, "is precisely what he appears to be: an observer, a messenger, perhaps even a student. But he is not the origin. You are certain of that?" Holmes turned toward me. "Entirely. And yet he was watching, recording, perhaps reporting." "Exactly." Holmes' expression grew intent, "and that, Watson, is the crucial point. Our adversary does not merely act, he learns. Each iteration of the pattern is observed, analyzed, and refined. The deaths are not ends in themselves, but data." I felt a renewed chill at his words. "Then the man behind this is conducting experiments." Holmes inclined his head, with a precision and detachment that place him among the most dangerous minds we have encountered. Inspector Lestrade returned some time later, his manner brisk, though tinged with frustration. "He's not talking," he said. "Claims he knows nothing, just happened to be passing by." Holmes smiled faintly, a statement which, though untrue, is not entirely without value. Lestrade frowned. I fail to see how. Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Pray sit, Inspector. You have, without realizing it, brought us precisely what we require." Lestrade sat reluctantly. "And what is that?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "A connection? To what?" "To the mind behind the mechanism," Holmes replied. He moved to the table and took up the box, examining it thoughtfully. Our prisoner observed the experiment, but did not intervene. This indicates two things. First, that he was not responsible for its execution. And second, that he had been instructed only to watch and report back, I said. "Precisely." Holmes set the box down again. "Now consider the nature of the design itself. It is not crude, nor is it purely mechanical. It depends upon an understanding of human behavior, spatial perception, and the subtle interplay between expectation and action." Lestrade shifted. "Impatiently, you're describing a very clever, Man, Holmes shook his head slightly. I am describing a very particular kind of man. He paused, then added, one who does not merely solve problems, but constructs them. A silence fell. You have someone in mind, I said quietly. Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he moved to his desk and opened a drawer, from which he withdrew a thin folder of papers. He selected one sheet and held it for a moment, as though weighing the significance of what it represented. At the university, he said at last, there was once a lecturer in an obscure figure, little known beyond a narrow circle of colleagues. His work, however, was of an unusual character. In what way? Lestrade asked. Holmes turned the paper so that we might see it. It contained a series of diagrams, intricate arrangements of lines and points, resembling both mathematical constructs and architectural plans. He studied the relationship between environment and cognition, Holmes said. How the arrangement of space influences thought, perception, and action. I leaned closer. You mean he could predict how a person would behave within a given setting? Holmes' eyes met mine. More than that. Watson, he could design that behavior. Lestrade let out a low whistle. And you think he's behind this? Holmes placed the paper down carefully. I do not think, Inspector, I deduce, and his name. Holmes' expression darkened slightly. Professor Alistair Vane. The name seemed to carry a weight of its own, though I could not immediately place it. He disappeared some years ago, Holmes continued. Vanished from his position under circumstances which were never fully explained. His work, considered by many to be unconventional, was quietly set aside. And now he's back, Lestrade said. Holmes inclined his head. If my reasoning is correct, then yes, though not in any manner that would invite recognition. I felt a growing sense of unease. You believe he is orchestrating these deaths as a form of experiment? Holmes' voice was quiet, but firm. I believe he is perfecting a system, a method by which the environment itself becomes the instrument of death, requiring neither force nor presence. Lestrade rose abruptly. Then we must find him, and quickly. Holmes raised a hand. That will not be so simple. Why not? Holmes' gaze returned to the window. Because a man such as Vane does not place himself within reach. He operates through layers, intermediaries, observers, controlled conditions. He remains, at all times, outside the pattern he creates. Then, how do we reach him? I asked. Holmes turned slowly back toward us. By doing precisely what we have already begun to do, he said. By demonstrating that his system is no longer beyond our comprehension. Lestrade frowned. You think that will draw him out? Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. I am certain of it. He paused, then added, for a mind such as his cannot tolerate uncertainty, each of all in the presence of an equal. The implication was unmistakable. You mean, I said, that he will come to confront you? Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. I mean, Watson, that he will not be able to resist the necessity of correction. A silence followed, and when he does, Lestrade asked. Holmes' expression grew resolute. Then he said, we shall at last meet the mind behind the mechanism. As I looked at him in that moment, I could not help but feel that the case had entered its most perilous phase, not merely a contest of evidence and deduction, but a direct confrontation between two intellects of the highest order, and somewhere beyond the fog and shadow of London, there waited a man who had turned thought itself into a weapon, and who now knew that. Sherlock Holmes had begun to understand him. If ever there was a moment in which I perceived the full gravity of the contest upon which Holmes had embarked, it was in the hours that followed the naming of Professor Alistair Vane. The atmosphere within Baker Street, already charged with tension, now acquired a sharper, more defined character, as though the unseen adversary had at last taken form within our minds, if not yet before our eyes. Holmes himself seemed altered in subtle but unmistakable ways. The quiet abstraction of his earlier reflections had given place to a focused intensity, a readiness that spoke of imminent action. "You expect him to act soon?" I said. As Holmes gathered several papers and instruments upon the table. "I expect him to act immediately," Holmes replied. "We have disrupted his sequence, exposed the limits of his design, and, most critically, allowed one of his observers to fall into our hands. Such an interruption cannot go unanswered." "Meant you believe he will come in person?" Holmes paused, considering. "Not at once," he said. "A man of Vane's temperament does not abandon caution lightly. But he will seek to reassert control, and in doing so, he must reveal himself, if only partially." Inspector Lestrade, who had returned with fresh reports from his men, placed his hat upon the table with a decisive gesture. "My officers are watching every known address connected to this Professor Vane," he said. "Former lodgings, acquaintances, anything we could find." Holmes inclined his head. "A prudent measure, though I fear it will yield little." Lestrade frowned. "You think he's vanished again?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that he has never been where we are looking." He moved toward the fireplace, resting one hand lightly upon the mantel. "Vane does not rely upon fixed positions. His work depends upon control of conditions, not locations. He will place himself only where those conditions may be observed and adjusted." "And where would that be?" I asked. Holmes turned, his eyes alight with a sudden clarity. "Where the pattern is strongest," he said. "Where it has been most fully realized." A silence fell. "The study," I said slowly. "The site of the first death." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." "Watson," Lestrade straightened at once. "Then we go?" There sat a watch. "Just as we did here." Holmes raised a hand. "No." Lestrade stared at him. "No?" Holmes' voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority. "If we repeat the same strategy, we play directly into his expectations. Vane anticipates observation, he anticipates pursuit. What he does not anticipate is interference." "And what form will that take?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes' gaze shifted briefly toward the box upon the table. "We shall alter the pattern," he said. "In what way?" I asked. Holmes stepped forward, his expression now one of quiet resolve. "By introducing an element which he has not accounted for, an imperfection." Lestrade shook his head. "You're speaking in riddles, Holmes." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Then let me be plain. We shall return to the study, but not as observers. We shall reconstruct the conditions once more, as we have done here, and then we shall break them." I felt a sudden understanding. "You mean to disrupt the mechanism while it is active?" "Exactly." "And you believe that will force him to act?" Holmes nodded. "It will do more than that, will compel him to intervene." Lestrade considered this. "And when he does, we take him." Holmes' expression grew grave. "If we are fortunate," there was something in his tone which caused me to look at him more closely. "You foresee a difficulty." I said. Holmes met my gaze. "I foresee a mind that does not fail easily," he replied. Preparations were made with all possible speed. Within the hour, we were once again conveyed through the darkened streets toward the house where the first victim had met his end. The fog, though less dense than before, still clung to the city in pale strands, and the gas lamps cast long, uncertain shadows along the pavement. Upon arrival, Lestrade's men secured the perimeter with quiet efficiency, while Holmes and I were admitted once more into the silent study. The room appeared unchanged, orderly, still, and faintly oppressive in its atmosphere. Holmes paused just within the doorway, his eyes moving rapidly over every detail. "Yes," he murmured, "it remains intact." He moved at once to the desk and began adjusting the objects upon it. restoring them to the precise arrangement he had previously observed. I assisted him as best I could, though I was keenly aware that I understood only a fraction of the significance behind each movement. "You must be exact, Watson," he said. "A deviation of even an inch may alter the outcome." "And that," I replied, "is precisely what we intend." Holmes glanced at me, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Just so. When all was prepared, he placed the box upon the desk in its original position and stepped back, surveying the room with critical care. "There," he said softly, "the pattern is restored." Lestrade entered, closing the door behind him. "All is ready outside," he said. "No one gets in or out without my knowing it." Holmes nodded. "Then we proceed." He moved once more into position before the desk, aligning himself as he had done at Baker Street. The air seemed to grow still almost at once, the same oppressive quality returning as the conditions fell into place. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "you will observe closely." He placed his hand upon the lid of the box, and at my signal, he added, "You will move that chair no more than an inch." I felt my pulse quicken. "That is all. That is everything," Holmes replied. He began to raise the lid. The effect manifested immediately. The stillness deepened, pressing inward with that same unnatural force I had come to dread. The room seemed to narrow, as though its very dimensions were being drawn toward a single, invisible point. Holmes held the position. "Now," he said, with careful precision, I moved the chair no more than the smallest fraction at once. The effect faltered. It did not vanish entirely as it had before, but wavered like a flame disturbed by a passing breath. Holmes' eyes flashed. "Excellent." And then from somewhere within the house there came a sound. Not loud, not abrupt, but distinct. A footstep. Holmes lowered the lid instantly and stepped back. "He is here," he said. Lestrade moved toward the door, his hand already upon his revolver. "Stay where you are," Holmes said sharply. "He will come to us." The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, a watchfulness, a tension that seemed to permeate the very air. The door handle turned slowly, and as it did, I realized that we stood at the threshold of the final confrontation, not with a method, nor with a mystery, but with the mind that had conceived them both. The door opened, not with violence, but with a slow and deliberate calm that, in its very restraint, conveyed a far greater sense of control than any sudden intrusion could have achieved. The man who entered did so without haste, closing the door behind him with quiet precision before turning to face us. He was of middle height, spare in frame, and dressed with an understated neatness that suggested neither wealth nor poverty, but rather a complete indifference to such distinctions. His face, pale and sharply defined, bore the unmistakable marks of an intellect both disciplined and severe. Yet it was in his eyes that the true nature of the man revealed itself, clear, unwavering, and possessed of that cold intensity which belongs only to those who place reason above all. "Other considerations. Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice measured and devoid of emotion. "I had hoped, though scarcely expected, that we might meet under such instructive circumstances." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though greeting an equal rather than confronting an adversary. "Professor Vane, I presume." The man allowed himself the faintest suggestion of a smile. "You presume correctly." Inspector Lestrade stepped forward at once. "Alistair Vane Ewell, come with me." "You're under arrest." Holmes raised a hand. "One moment, Inspector." Lestrade hesitated, clearly reluctant. But Holmes' authority in such matters was not easily contested. Vane, for his part, appeared entirely unconcerned. "You have interrupted my work, Mr. Holmes," he said calmly. though I cannot deny that you have done so with a degree of elegance that merits acknowledgement." Holmes' expression remained composed. "Your work, Professor, has resulted in multiple deaths. I should think that places it beyond the realm of academic interest." Vane's gaze shifted briefly to the box upon the desk. "On the contrary," he said, "it elevates it." A silence fell, heavy with implication. Holmes stepped slightly forward. "You constructed a system," he said, "in which the environment itself becomes the instrument of death. The box is merely a catalyst, a means of positioning the subject within a precisely defined spatial arrangement." Vane inclined his head. "Go on," Holmes continued, his voice steady and exact. "The effect depends upon a convergence of conditions: angle, stillness, and the subject's own posture. When these are aligned, a subtle but fatal disruption occurs. Whether physiological or neurological is, at present, of secondary importance. What matters is that the victim, unaware of the mechanism, completes the pattern through their own actions." Vane's eyes gleamed faintly. "An admirable summary." Lestrade looked between them in frustration. "Well, someone explain how this actually kills a man." Holmes did not take his eyes from Vane. "It is not a matter of force, Inspector, but of influence. The human body is not merely a physical structure, it is also an electrical and perceptual system. Under certain conditions, those systems may be disrupted." Vane spoke softly, precisely. Holmes nodded. "You discovered a method by which spatial arrangement, combined with focused attention, induces a catastrophic failure within the brain's processing and overload, if you will, triggered not by an external agent, but by the subject's own perception of their surroundings." Lestrade stared in disbelief. "You're telling me a man can be killed just by standing in the wrong place?" Vane answered before Holmes could speak. "Not merely standing. The distinction is everything." Holmes' gaze hardened slightly. "And you tested this theory first upon individuals whose habits made them predictable, then upon those of lesser caution, refining the pattern with each iteration." Vane clasped his hands behind his back. "Progress demands observation, Mr. Holmes. One does not arrive at precision without eliminating uncertainty." "And the notes?" I asked suddenly. "The message is the gift was accepted. The pattern improves. They were records of your results." Vane turned his eyes toward me. "Indeed, Doctor. A most efficient means of documentation." Holmes stepped closer. "You miscalculated in one respect, however." Vane's expression did not change. "Oh?" "You assumed that the pattern, once perfected, would remain beyond interference, that its subtlety would render it invulnerable to disruption." Holmes gestured toward the room. "But as we have demonstrated, the system contains a flaw. A minute alteration, a shift of less than an inch is sufficient to destabilize the entire effect." For the first time, something passed across Vane's face, not surprise, but recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was unexpected." Holmes' voice remained calm. "And it is precisely that imperfection which renders your design incomplete." Vane considered this for a moment, then nodded slightly. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes, it renders it evolving." Lestrade stepped forward again. "That's enough. You've said quite enough." Vane did not resist as the inspector moved to take him into custody. Instead, his gaze remained fixed upon Holmes. "You have done something remarkable," he said. "You have not merely understood the system, you have entered it and emerged unscathed." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "A necessary step." Vane's lips curved faintly. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, did you not feel it? That moment, when the pattern aligns." Holmes did not answer. Vane continued. "That instant in which the world seems to narrow to focus, to resolve into a single, perfect point of comprehension. It is exquisite." I felt a chill at his words, and deadly. Holmes said, then inclined his head, only to those who do not understand it. Lestrade placed a firm hand upon his shoulder. You can explain all that at the yard, as he was led toward the door. Vane paused and looked back once more. This is not the end, Mr. Holmes, he said quietly. It is merely a beginning. Holmes' expression remained unchanged. Then I shall look forward, he replied, to ensuring that it remains unfinished. Vane allowed himself a final, faint smile before he was taken from the room. The door closed behind him. A long silence followed. Lestrade exhaled deeply. I don't know whether to thank you or question my sanity, he said. But at least it's over. Holmes, however, did not immediately respond. His gaze had returned to the box upon the desk, now inert and harmless in appearance. Over, he said at last. He shook his head slightly. No, Inspector, not over. I felt a sudden unease. What do you mean? Holmes turned toward me, his expression thoughtful. We have stopped the man, he said. But the idea, he let the sentence hang, remains. The weight of his words settled heavily upon me. For I knew then that while the immediate danger had passed, the implications of what we had uncovered extended far beyond a single case, and as we prepared to leave that silent room once more, I could not help but feel that we had glimpsed something far more profound and far more troubling than a mere method of murder. We had glimpsed a mind that sought to turn reality itself into a weapon, and that, I feared, was a danger not so easily contained. In the days that followed the arrest of Professor Alistair Vane, London resumed its usual rhythm with a swiftness that has ever seemed to me both remarkable and faintly disquieting. The fog lifted, the streets filled once more with their accustomed bustle, and the grim events which had so recently cast a shadow over the city were reduced, in the public mind, to little more than a curious series of unexplained deaths soon to be forgotten amid the endless tide of new concerns. Yet for those of us who had stood at the very center of that strange and perilous design, the memory lingered with a persistence not easily dismissed. Inspector Lestrade, I learned, had secured Vane's confinement under conditions of the strictest supervision, though the particulars of the case were, by necessity, withheld from general disclosure. Indeed, it was deemed prudent that the true nature of Vane's method should not become widely known, for fear that it might invite imitation by minds less scrupulous, yet no less ambitious. Thus the official record spoke only of unusual circumstances, and the matter was, in all outward respects, considered resolved. Holmes, for his part, displayed none of the outward satisfaction that might have been expected from so decisive a conclusion. On the contrary, he seemed, if anything, more withdrawn than before, his thoughts frequently turning inward, his manner marked by a quiet abstraction that I had come to associate with problems not yet fully laid to rest. One evening, some days after the affair had concluded, I found him seated by the window of our rooms at Baker Street, his gaze directed not at any particular object, but at the shifting interplay of light and shadow upon the street below. The box, the silent instrument of so much danger, had been removed, yet its absence seemed almost as significant as its former presence. You are not entirely satisfied, I said. Taking my customary seat opposite him, Holmes did not immediately reply. At length he spoke, his voice calm and reflective. Satisfaction, my dear Watson, is a condition best reserved for those who deal in certainties, and this case has left you with uncertainties. Holmes turned his head slightly. It has left me with implications. I considered this. You refer to Vane's method. Precisely. Holmes rose and crossed slowly to the mantel, resting one hand upon it as he continued. What we encountered was not merely a device, nor even a technique, but a principle, a demonstration of how environment, perception, and human behavior may be combined into a single, coherent system. Vane did not create something new. He revealed something that has always existed. though unrecognized. And now that it is recognized, I said, it can be used. Holmes inclined his head, or misused. A silence followed. You believe others may attempt to replicate it. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. I believe that knowledge, once uncovered, cannot easily be confined. It may lie dormant, it may be forgotten for a time, but it does not cease to exist. I felt a faint unease. Then have we truly ended the danger? Holmes turned toward me, and for a moment there was a rare softness in his expression. We have ended this danger, Watson, he said, and that, for the present, must suffice. He resumed his seat, reaching for his violin, which lay upon the table nearby. With a practiced motion, he drew the bow across the strings, producing a low, resonant note that seemed to echo faintly through the room. Vain sought perfection, he continued, almost as though speaking to himself. A system without flaw, without uncertainty. Yet it was precisely the presence of imperfection, the smallest deviation, that rendered his design vulnerable. You mean the flaw was inevitable? Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. In all human endeavors, Watson, it always is. He began to play then softly at first, the melody slow and contemplative, yet carrying within it a depth of feeling that words could scarcely convey. I listened in silence, reflecting upon the strange course of events that had brought us to this quiet moment, and upon the mind we had encountered, a mind that had sought to impose order upon chaos, and in doing so had nearly transformed thought itself into a weapon. At length, Holmes ceased playing and lowered the violin. The world, he said, is a far more delicate construction than most suppose. A shift here, a movement there, and the entire structure alters. He looked toward me, his eyes once more bright with that familiar, penetrating intelligence. Our task, Watson, is not merely to observe these shifts, but to understand them, to prevent them. I asked. Holmes' smile returns light, but unmistakable. To anticipate them, he said. He rose then and moved toward the window once more, gazing out upon the now clear street, where the life of the city continued, untroubled and unaware. Come, Watson, he added lightly. I believe the game, for the moment, is concluded. He paused, then, with a quiet finality, until the next move. And so the matter of the unopened gift hand, the dark design it concealed, passed into the annals of those singular cases which, though resolved in fact, continued to echo in thought long after their conclusion. For my own part, I have never since regarded the simple arrangement of a room, or the act of opening an innocuous box, with quite the same ease. And as for Sherlock Holmes, he had already turned his mind to the next mystery.